Morning everyone, welcome. If you can refrain from looking at the lovely view for just 10 minutes and have a look at this, I'll just give you a brief update about kiwifruit's most unwanted and the process we get to those pests that we don't want in New Zealand in our kiwifruit. So this here is just to give you a really quick process summary of how we get there, and all I really want you to take away from this is that we start with this really comprehensive list up there of potential threats that we know to the kiwifruit industry, and we have a process that works through, and then we get down here to our most unwanted. So that's our top 8 threats that we don't want to get here in New Zealand. So as I mentioned, KVH maintains this register of potential biosecurity threats. So this is pests and pathogens that could impact the kiwifruit industry. It's a long list. It sits on our website and it has over 70 threats currently sitting on it. So we populate this list through a couple means. The first one is keeping an eye out for scientific literature and publications that come up on the internet and in other forums or that get sent to us. But another really important way to populate this list is through some more informal conversations. So it's about talking to growers offshore, talking to growers here who have heard about anything happening offshore. And that's because it gives us a real-time update about what's happening globally. While scientific publications are a great way to understand the risk, they also take a while to publish and to process. So by the time we're getting it at our door, it means that it's been out there for a little while. So it's these connections that we have offshore, what's happening globally, really important for us to be able to add to this list and keep an eye on the risk. And if that changes, then we will have this list and we can update it as we need. Also, just down here, we have 24 fact sheets of those threats that are greatest sitting on our website, and this just gives a little bit more information about where they come from, how they could get there, and why we're worried about them. So in 2014, KVH developed the risk matrix, and the purpose of it is that we need an ability to prioritise these threats so that we can get the best bang for our buck when we look at our readiness and research investment. We don't have enough money or enough resource to cover 70 pests and pathogens really thoroughly, so we need to be able to reduce this list to those ones that are most important to our industry and make sure that we're prepared should they come. It's also been developed so we have this consistent approach, because these threats to our industry, they're not all insect pests. They can be fungi, they can be viruses, they can be bacteria. So we need a way that we can consistently prioritise these across the board to know which ones are the greatest threat. It is a living document, so this is the first update I've done. I've been at KVH for 8 months, but we look to update it annually after the high risk season. So after fruit fly and BMSB seasons have been complete and we understand what's happening there, we try to update the risk matrix to reflect any of those changes and potentially any changes that have happened before that. That's not to say that if something happens and the risk profile changes for any of the pests or pathogens before that we wouldn't update it in between that time, but we definitely annually we update it to make sure that it's current and up to date. So this is the framework, and you might not be able to read it, but I'll run through it really quickly. It has 4 categories, and each category has a score. These categories we borrowed or we worked with MPI. They use a similar system, not exactly the same, but to help prioritise their threats. So it is used across a range of government and industries or something similar. And it's important to know that the scores are somewhat subjective, so they can change. And depending what's happening at the border and what measures are being implemented across the system, these scores will vary. So the first one we look at is this likelihood of entry. So where is it found globally, and do we trade with these countries? And looking at the pathways that it could enter on, whether it's a fruit-bound pest, so we're looking at the pathways of fruit entering, or is it a hitchhiker, so we're looking at containers and what's found within those containers. And a really good indication of its likelihood of entry, especially in real time, is the level of border and post-border interceptions. If we're finding it at our borders and we're finding it post-border, then this likelihood of entry is obviously really high. The next is the likelihood of establishment. So even if it has a really high likelihood of entry, if it can't establish in New Zealand, then obviously the risk is quite minimal. So we look at things like, is the organism able to colonise other countries? Does it have a really strong invasive ability? A good example of an organism that is BMSB, started off in Asia, went to the USA, and now it's rapidly spreading throughout Europe. And the other one is the suitability of the New Zealand climate. So New Zealand has great climate to grow kiwifruit. Unfortunately, great kiwifruit climate often aligns with great climate for pests and pathogens. So New Zealand quite often has a really good climate for some of these bugs. And the last important one in establishment is, do we have an effective trapping or surveillance system? So a real key way to stop establishment is to detect it early. So a good example of a trapping system would be our fruit fly system that we have in New Zealand. So we have about 7,500 traps spread out New Zealand looking for fruit fly should they enter, and that allows us to get early detection. And with early detection, it means we can hopefully stop its establishment. So that's really important. And then we look at the threat's impact to production. Does it affect fruit quality? Is there fruit loss? How does it affect the vines? How does it affect the storage? All these things to see what the production impacts could be. And then lastly, we look at the impact to trade. So where can we export our fruit should this arrive? Do we have market access restrictions in any of our major markets that will affect where we can export our fruit? So this is the updated risk matrix. So we ran 20 pests from the comprehensive list through that scoring system we did, and this is what we got. So lots of these are probably ones you will know because they've been on the list for a long time, since its first iteration in 2014, and I'm just going to quickly run through some of the new ones. So the first one is the spotted lanternfly. So this is a new addition. It hasn't been on any previous version, and that's because it's becoming increasingly invasive. So it's now found in the US, and some people believe in the US that it could be a bigger threat than BMSB. The next one is the South American fruit fly, also a new addition. And the reason this one differs is we have these top 3 fruit flies at the top, and they're lure responsive. So that trapping system that I talked about, that captures those flies. South American fruit fly down here, it doesn't have a lure, it doesn't have a pheromone that it's attracted to, so it means we don't have a system in New Zealand to help capture it early to stop that establishment. So it increases its risk. And it also has major market access implications because it's found in a limited area. And the last big change is spotted winged Drosophila. So that's been on the list in the top 8 since the first iteration in 2014. We now think that kiwifruit is not a host. It's found in all kiwifruit growing regions, and there's been no reports of impacts to kiwifruit. So we've dropped that one out, and some of those new additions have jumped in. So from that most unwanted, or from that risk matrix, we get these most unwanted. So these are identified as our biggest biosecurity threats to the kiwifruit industry. Lots of these I've talked about, and you'll know we've got the fruit flies, and we've got that Queensland fruit fly response that's currently happening in Auckland. Brown marmorated stink bug, Ceratocystis, which we're lucky enough to have an expert from Brazil talking to us today about it. Spotted lanternfly, and I'll just have a little bit of a talk about him in a second. And these other ones down here. So PSA, which is those non-New Zealand strains. And then we've got some soil-borne pathogens, Phytophthora and verticillium wilt, and white peach scale. I think it's important to note that we understand that these aren't the only pests that could enter into New Zealand on kiwifruit. We acknowledge that the next big threat may not be on the list. However, we do a degree of generic readiness and response planning, and this allows us to be prepared across organisms. So while we prioritise these, for example, we have a readiness plan for Brazilian wilt up there. That's a soil-borne pathogen, and that can be utilised across many other soil-borne pathogens with minimal changes depending on the organism. So we are prepared outside of these 8, but that's our real focus. And lastly, I thought I'd just quickly touch on spotted lanternfly and our scoring and why we've added it to the list. So the likelihood of entry, it's actually quite low at 0.3 out of 1, and there's a few reasons for that. Where does it occur? So currently it's not really widespread. It's found in the northwest of the USA, across about 3 states, and in Asia. And we haven't had any border or post-border detections to date that have been recorded. So that's a good sign that in the current state, it isn't entering in large numbers. That's to say, not to say that as it potentially spreads throughout the USA and possibly further, that this may be more of a likelihood. But it does have quite a high likelihood of establishment. So exposure assessment, once post-border, how likely is it that an organism will find suitable hosts? So it has over 70 hosts reported that it can feed on, so that's quite a large range. And Tree of Heaven, which is found in New Zealand, is a really preferred host. It's found in spots, it's not widely distributed, but that's not to say that it's not an obligate host, it doesn't require it, it just really prefers it. So if it's not here, that's not to say it wouldn't jump onto something else. We have a really suitable climate, especially our kiwifruit growing regions. And this one here is really big. Can an effective trapping system be implemented? No, there's currently no pheromones or trapping systems in place, and the only method is really visual monitoring, or they use sticky traps on the bands of trees. So if it gets here, our chances of catching it earlier are a little bit less than something like fruit fly. It has a really high production impact, or potentially. It's causing real big problems in grapes in the US where it's invasive. And we know that it's been reported as a pest in China where it's native. And the big one is we don't really have many tools to manage it if it arrived. It just flies away if you spray it with chemicals. So a lot of the methods they use in the USA are manual. They require scraping eggs off trees and really labour intensive, not too easy to do things. However, the trade impact is actually quite low because they aren't a fresh produce pathway pest. So they lay the eggs on inanimate pathways like containers and vehicles, and they're not considered to be a fresh produce pest, so they shouldn't affect how we export our fruit. And that is me. No questions because it's still after. But all that information I just said is found on the website. If you want to know more about the risk matrix and the spotted lanternfly, but for all the other pests, then you can just go on our website and it's all sitting there. Cheers.